Hello and welcome. You're watching Raisina 2019. We are here in conversation around issues that we believe matter to all of us and are going to play a key role in shaping the future of the entire world. Conversations happening here at the Facebook studios and two very special guests, in fact, now with me. We're looking in this session on if we can still avoid a high-tech dystopia. We're all, of course, knowing about the technology being the technology being present, and how is it going to alter our tomorrow as we know it? That's what we're looking at, and who better than my guests here. It's a privilege to have both of them on this issue this evening. Let me introduce Kara Frederick, Research Associate, Technology and National Security Program, Center for New American Security. Also with us is Bedavyasa Mohanty, Associate Fellow at ORF. Thanks both so much for taking our time to be with us. Kara, let me start by asking you, for all those who say that talk about the future, when we look at technology and all that we have at hand, be it, you mentioned facial recognition a short while back, artificial intelligence, machine learning, surveillance of the kind that we are seeing today, the future in a sense is already here. We are in it, even if it feels like a retro future at times. This is a tough question to answer briefly, but what are the key issues that you're seeing in different hotspots, let's say, around the world that could challenge us, the world order as we know it tomorrow?
All right, where to choose from? So I think I would start off by saying technology was supposed to be the great democratizer of our age, right? So you have the advent of social media, even the internet. It was supposed to wrench the power of information from the hands of many and give it to the hands of a few. We wanted it to air marginalized perspectives and elevate new views in a meritocracy of ideas that we'd never seen before, and even just generally propagate a more open society. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, it doesn't really seem like that vision is coming to pass. In fact, an opposite vision is sort of, we're seeing the outlines of that in different areas of the world today. And I would point to disinformation campaigns on social media that threaten social discourse, facial recognition technologies that are developing a hold on their populations of autocratic regimes, and user data that's exploited to target individuals for manipulation. So that's kind of the broad framework that we're working in. Specific countries that are propagating these this sort of high-tech liberalism. China is obviously one of the biggest ones. So the facial recognition technologies that they're utilizing in Xinjiang, for example, has been widely reported. They're able to look at unprecedented amounts of data and sort of layer that together to sort of establish patterns to see what their populations are doing. They're also exporting these technologies. An AI company, Chinese, exported a facial recognition system to Zimbabwe recently because not all the data that they're getting is great data, so they wanted to branch out and diversify what they're getting to make their AI systems better that way. So those are some brief examples from China. Russia, as we know, is continuing to take their disinformation campaigns overseas after testing them in proximate proving grounds like Ukraine. You have Iran, which also was on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, sort of propagating pro-regime messaging. And then lastly, you have Saudi Arabia in the wake of the Khashoggi murder. They were flooding Twitter with pro-regime messaging to sort of flood out the any dissident or any support for what had happened with regard to the support in the United States. So those are just a few examples of the way certain regimes are using technology to maybe make a dystopian future more of a reality than it is now.
So just very quickly before I go to Beda, so when I say that, when we ask, can we still avoid a high-tech dystopia? Does it look like we're there? There's no getting away from it?
Not necessarily, especially as we've heard in a lot of the conversations today. If there's a bifurcation that might happen, especially with regard to the internet and China, and some people are saying, yeah, people are going to have to choose sides, but then I think we established that there is still a desire for collaboration. People are sort of seeing what's happening and saying, okay, this is something to think about very seriously in the future, and I think you have certain movements, certain communities agreeing among themselves that maybe we're going to start self-policing this kind of thing before it gets truly out of hand. So the jury's still out on that, and I think the more the problem gets more airplay, then we can sort of talk about more productive solutions and strategies, especially those that take into consideration the civilian private sector and how they're the ones who are sort of at the forefront of these cutting-edge technologies and their development. So they'll be an increasingly major player in, you know, who uses these technologies and for what.
Right. So I guess, more, as you're saying, it's important for people to walk the talk on this and all that they're saying. Absolutely. It's interesting that you brought up the need to sort of keep the spotlight on issues like this, sort of keep the focus, keep talking about them at platforms like this. At the same time, the role of the media in perpetuating what we are seeing, you know, look at India, for instance. We are having a serious issue with, say, hate speech. Yeah. You know, so how does that really come into play when we talk about a tech dystopia?
Let me just take a slight curve before I get to your point. I completely agree with Kara about the need to just keep reiterating these conversations over and over again. A fundamental problem that I think in thinking about this is we can't wait for the science fiction idea of a dystopia to come to us before we start taking action, right? Because it tends to work in more innocuous ways. And oddly enough, science fiction holds some examples. If you look at your V for Vendetta, Clockwork Orange, all of those things, the first things to often fall within dystopian societies are things like right to privacy, the freedom of expression, the right of disclosing or not disclosing a sexuality. You know, it's these things that are relegated to a sort of a secondary importance when compared to a right to life or so on. It's a combination of these factors that turn a society into a dystopian society. Too much police powers and so on and so forth. So when we're talking about integrating data into policing, into analyzing responses and influence operations, we are inching ever closer towards that dystopian reality, right? So any policy responses that we imagine now have to tackle these at the very root. You can't hack or manipulate 100% of the data that isn't there. So why are we collecting data when we don't need it, right? Is all of this like, you know, data is the new oil, everyone thinks it can be monetized, but that doesn't mean that we have to collect in an excess before we ascribe a value to it. And that's just one of the things. And
collect and now we want to keep it close. We want to make sure that it's in our territorial boundaries. We don't want to let it out now.
There is obviously that. It's things like localization that cause fragmentation. And once you localize, you essentially have the carte blanche to do whatever you want with it, which is where your compromise of privacy, freedom of expression, and so on comes forth. We have seen obviously examples from China and the way that they have been able to regulate a significant part of their industry. But the thing is, the Chinese control has now sort of infused into and interfered with the operation of other countries. An example that we saw in India was after the Doklam crisis. People who were using Chinese apps, Chinese browsers, and Googling the Doklam issue would get the first result as Global Times, right? So these are innocuous ways in which you know, the Chinese perspective or propaganda would then be pushed up to the forefront of the conversation. We've seen how Pakistan was able to track, you know, Indian army locations in the aftermath of the Pathankot attack by infusing that free app into their phones and so on. So it's just things like this that, if not controlled, you know, lead to a massive scale data misuse. Now, when faced with these realities, governments often take the instinctive action of you know, adopting heavy-handed technological measures, breaking down encryption, restricting use of certain apps and so on. But we have to think further, and that's where I think the role of the media comes in. Because unless these issues are discussed in the popular discourse, no nuanced response will be possible. If you tackle only the surface level symptoms and not the problem that underlies.
So the deep dive that really is often needed, and sort of look beyond what you see on the surface. But you know, Beda touched upon something that I want to speak to both of you about in greater detail, and that is about when we talk about national security. What happens to, say, certain human rights? What happens to privacy? And this is a debate that we are seeing in India. We're sort of hearing a lot more than we are used to in India. So how big a concern is this? And are tech corporations sort of taking note?
I think they are, and I think for the first time they're sort of establishing these official principles and sets of ethics, and sort of, as I mentioned before, they know they're at the forefront of the development is outpacing the attempts to govern tech in a lot of ways, right? So they're even, look at Google, they have a set of AI ethics and principles, and the United States doesn't even have a national AI strategy right now. So a lot of the tech companies are recognizing these things and sort of taking it upon themselves to establish a codified list of this is how we want to operate and these are our goals. And
so self-regulation is sort of, or maybe not.
It's to a degree. I mean that works and doesn't work. So I don't want to espouse the virtues of self-regulation. I mean, we've seen how tech companies have failed in the past in that regard, but I do think that when they realize their engineering core is at the forefront of these new developments, that okay, if we're going to constrain them in any way, if they're not going to be used for ill, like in a dual-use capacity, technology can be used for good and it can be used for ill. Technology itself is neutral. It's a tool in many aspects, but we are seeing how it's been perverted and politicized and corrupted. Again, like I said in the beginning, it's no longer just the force for good that the tech companies of the world of Silicon Valley thought they were making this tech for. It doesn't always end up that way. So, okay, maybe we need to think about how we would constrain its use and internally. And I think it's a good thing that they're thinking about this, but I do think that the dialogue needs to consist of not only the civilian and private sector, but governments, AI scientists, ethicists, and the people who are doing the actual technological development, but also people who exist and live and work in society. They are going to be the ones that are predominantly affected by these things, especially by artificial intelligence. And so why not they have a voice? Right,
and I think for many of those players also the relationship has become very adversarial, and we sort of need to move beyond that as well. Last question, because I'm being told time's up, Veda, which is, what about inclusivity? What about making sure that it's actually the World Wide Web, that it's beyond just the 40% of the world that has access to the internet, that we are truly making it inclusive? How big a challenge is that going to be? Because in 49 of the world's poorest countries, only 5% of those populations have access to the internet.
Most definitely, and that question of inclusion is in fact something that guides a lot of policy, because what we've seen so far, in conversations around data localization and fragmentation and so on, a lot of the gripe that, say, the emerging world has had is because policies are defined and governed by the sort of economic and network centers of the world. United States driving and creating policies, which often leaves out the priorities that emerging countries have. So even, and because of the network world, everyone is vulnerable. There is no our borders, securing our borders is securing our state anymore, because the cost of cyber attacks, interference, influence operations, etc. has gone down massively, right? So if you don't look at building capacity within these organizations, within these countries in fact, then you're not going to be able to secure your own borders, and unilaterally writing and driving policy is not going to get you there. India, for instance, is both a target and the point of origin of a lot of cyber attacks in the world. And part of that is because we don't have the capacity to detect them, to prevent them, and so on. And the attacks that originate out of India or are routed through India affect everyone, affect all the networks that India is connected to. So, I mean, there is a strong case to be made for a multilateral sort of approach that takes into account all of the concerns of these countries, and that's what we should be aiming for in our normative approaches.
Absolutely, and I think the challenge is not just to stay ahead now, but just to keep up with what's happening. That's just going to be the thing. But Kara, Veda, thanks so much for your time. There's plenty of food for thought there, and to keep sending your feedback in. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.